Chapter 32. Our first customer was a brand new delver named Taylor, who'd wandered into the shop from the access door in the lobby. She was a wide-eyed and terrified 22-year-old from Oklahoma State University and, much like me, she'd neglected after a drunken rager. Though her rager had been at a sorority party instead of a bachelor party, but that was really just semantics. Croc and I explained the situation to her as gently but realistically as possible, helped her integrate with the virus using the in-store monolith, then let her catch a full night's rest. In the morning, Princess Pony Puff outfitted the college girl with one of the basic delver kits we'd assembled, then dropped her off in the parking garage on floor 1. Honestly, it felt a little cruel to just toss her back into the wild where there was a good chance she'd end up dead in weeks if she was lucky, and days if she wasn't. That or worse, considering the fate of the faceless who inhabited the parking garage. As shitty as it made me feel, that was just the reality of this place. I couldn't help everyone indefinitely, and if people wanted to survive, they were going to have to fight for it. That was just the way of the backrooms. Were we sending them out like lambs to the slaughter? Maybe. But at least we were sending those lambs out with machetes and enough survival know-how to have a fighting chance. We also let her keep the red yarn ring and told her she was welcome to come back anytime, so long as she had tokens to spend or relics to trade. By day 8, we had a steady stream of new delvers trickling in. Usually 2 or 3 per day, from places as close to home as Texas and as far away as Kyiv. They were college kids and soldiers, housewives and day laborers, teachers and lawyers. Men, women, young, old, and everything in between. We even got a Greek Orthodox priest who didn't speak a lick of English. One and all, we gave them a rough rundown on the backrooms, a decent night's sleep, and a survival kit to see them on their way. It was the most we could do. Hell, we were running out of the backpacks so quickly that Croc and I had to raid the style for less for a second time. We also paid a visit to a camping store called Open Sky Outfitters, on the 3rd floor. We killed a handful of dwellers and raided the outdoor essentials section, stockpiling on things like hatchets, machetes, ropes, and magnesium fire starters, then loaded up on collapsible, green camp cots. For the most part, the survival supplies went into the kits, while the cots replaced the makeshift sleeping pallets in the back storage space, behind the refrigerated coolers. I added a trio of large tents as well, which I planned to rent out for those who wanted a little extra privacy while they slept. Which was probably most people, considering that Princess Pony Puff had developed a terrible habit of watching people sleep with her cold, unblinking doll eyes. She was so creepy that even Croc continued to feel uncomfortable around her. It was at the tail end of the 2nd week, just when I was starting to give up hope of ever attracting a paying customer, that a level 25 delver slunk into our shop, via the door I'd planted on the 3rd floor. He moved with stealthy, lethal grace, like a prowling cat, and constantly scanned every aisle for any sign of danger. I'd spent a lot of time with Marines who had PTSD. This guy had all the symptoms: hypervigilance, open hostility, obvious anxiety, and extreme mistrust. He also wasn't completely human, though he wasn't a dweller either. At least, not according to the tag that appeared above his head. Delver number 12T-01, B0BFX6X9M9, Central, Transmog level 25. The tag clearly labeled him as a delver, just like every other person who'd wandered through the store so far, but I'd never heard of a Central before, and he sure as shit didn't look human. Humanoid, in that he stood upright like a man and had 2 arms and 2 legs. But he also had sleek, pale white serpent scales covering every inch of his visible skin, shimmering violet hair, and a pair of upward curling black horns protruding from his forehead. As someone who'd grown up going to a Southern Baptist church every Sunday, I was inclined to call him a demon. Except, I was guessing the similarities were both superficial and coincidental. The guy wore tight leather pants, a pair of clunky black Doc Martens, and a beat-up leather jacket with a hood stitched into the lining. Beneath the jacket was a full ringmail shirt, cinched tight at the waist by a leather belt with a small circular buckler hanging from one hip. He had a leather glove covering his left hand, rising all the way to his elbow, and slung over his shoulders was what I could only call a bazooka. But the launcher was spray-painted with so much colorful graffiti that it looked like it's something that belonged in Fortnite and not out here in the real world. Not that this was the real world, I supposed. As I studied the newcomer more closely, the researcher's codex populated a more thorough description. Although Sendrils look like overgrown snakes, they are actually the distant offspring of the long-dead dragon lords of Vitharia. They consider themselves a proud race. Everyone else considers them to be colossal assholes. Oh, look at me, I'm the offspring of a dragon. No one fucking cares, Jerry. Unfortunately, Sendrils can back up their arrogance. They are strong, fast, and basically fireproof, plus they have some nasty magical resistances. They also regenerate health at a crazy rate and can regrow limbs, so there's that. On the flip side, they suck a wheelbarrow full of assholes when it comes to utilizing any relics that require mana. Their bodies just aren't built for it. Best bet, kill them at a distance before they can get close enough to turn you into red meat sauce. Another brief prompt appeared beneath the more detailed description. Would you like to use the codex to examine this Delver's spatial core? Yes, no? Huh. Now that was curious. I hadn't seen that prompt with the other Delvers I'd met so far, but then all of those Delvers were brand new and hadn't added any relics to their spatial core. So maybe I hadn't seen the prompt because there was nothing for me to see inside them. I hit yes. Nothing happened. There was a brief pulse of energy that flared around the Sendril, and the codex simply failed. You shouldn't do that, the man hissed, his voice smooth with a slight German lilt to it. It's considered extremely rude to scan another Delver without their permission. And if you are going to do it, you should know that it generally only works on Delvers of a similar or lower level. He paused, eyes narrowing. And it'll never work on a Sendril. He cocked his head and studied me more closely. How is it that a level 15 has a scan ability at all, I wonder? Or all this, for that matter. He swept out a hand, gesturing at the store. What possible relic could one so low-level have to accomplish such things? Where I'm from, I replied evenly, it's considered rude to ask what someone has in their spatial core. The man's lips pulled up into a lopsided smile and he snorted. Touché, he said, acknowledging the verbal parry. For what's it worth, though, I'm sorry, I added after a second. I didn't need to apologize, but I didn't want to create bad blood between us, especially since this was the first Delver I'd ever met who'd been in the backrooms longer than me. Plus, I needed allies, not enemies, and a few words of apology could go a long way toward making friends. Wasn't trying to offend. I'm just new around here. Still learning the ropes. The grin faded and the Sendril folded his arms across his chest. I've seen a lot of strange things in the backrooms, but that is a little hard to believe, even for me. I'll admit that this operation of yours is new enough, but there's no way you are fresh meat, even if you were only level 15. He dropped his voice low and leaned forward. Come now, it is just the two of us, huh? Who are you working for, huh? Which sovereign set this up? I'm guessing we can rule out the flayed monarch, based on that little entry notice of yours. He trailed off, rubbing thoughtfully at his chin. But then, that is precisely the kind of message the flayed monarch would have you write if he were trying to deflect suspicions regarding his involvement. Finally, the Sendril grimaced and shook his head. No, perhaps I'm overthinking this. I feel like Wallace Shawn from The Princess Bride. It is not the Skinless Court, but it is certainly the work of one of the great rulers or another. The Lord of Coin, perhaps? He offered, cocking an eyebrow. This certainly seems in line with his motives. Or the Iron Tyrant? Could even be the Sorority Queen. I raised a hand to forestall him. It's none of those. Like the sign says, this is neutral territory. I don't have any ties to anyone, though I may have gotten off to a bad start with the aspirants of the Skinless Court, I reluctantly conceded. Well, as you Americans are so fond of saying, fuck him. He tossed up both hands as though in dismissal. No one likes those Arschlocker anyway, the Sendril continued, offering me a sly serpentine grin. If you had to pick a faction to start the war with, that is the best of the lot. The flayed monarch is the most powerful of all the sovereigns, true, but he's also the most deeply resented and hated. He scratched his chin. Still, it is a bit of a good news, bad news type situation, I suppose. I take it that means you're not on friendly terms with them? I asked. His face darkened noticeably, then he slowly and carefully peeled off the glove covering his left hand. He winced as the garment came away, revealing not scales but a bloody red limb devoid of scales or skin. Just exposed muscle and sinew. That would be a fair assessment, he replied. This is what they do to those who cross them. They take pieces. Trophies. Then they fashion them into capes and cowls. I've even seen a high-level aspirant wearing someone else's leg skin as a pair of pants. He shook his head in clear disapproval. Very disturbing to say the least. Wait, I said, brow furrowing in confusion. But I thought aspirants flayed themselves as they advanced through the court? Oh, they do, the Sendril said in earnest, which can make it a little confusing. The difference is, when they do it to an enemy, they have magics to make sure the wound never heals and the pain never goes away. Not ever, he said softly, and I could hear the muffled anguish in his voice. When they do it to themselves, however, the process evokes a feeling of ecstasy. Or so I'm told, he finished, before gingerly slipping the leather glove back in place. Now, if we are done with the interrogations, allow me to introduce myself properly. I'm Jacob. Called Jacob of Grief, by some, and Jacob the Scales, by others. He extended his good hand and I noticed there was a small red piece of yarn tied around his pinky finger. Dan, I replied, accepting the proffered limb and giving it a firm pump. I surmised as much, Jacob said, considering the name of your little store here. Discount Dan's backroom bargains. It's a mouthful, but there is a certain ring to it, I must admit. Mind if I ask you another question since we are being so friendly? I asked, releasing his ironclad grip. It's your store, is it not? The Sendril replied, cocking a scaly eyebrow. I think that entitles you to do quite as you please, don't you agree? I shrugged. That's true, but since we're speaking candidly, I can tell you that I'm looking to make allies and I'm not aiming to offend. I doubt very much anything you say could offend me. He tapped at his scales. I have thick skin. I chuckled. Right, fair enough. I let my next question rip. What's a transmog? My God, but you really are new here, Jacob said, sounding rather scandalized. That or you're a great actor and you're nailing the whole naivete angle. He paused, regarding me with fresh eyes. Transmogs are delvers who assume a new racial alignment. I'm not really a Sendril, or at least, I wasn't always a Sendril. Once I was human, very much like you. That was 5 or 6 years ago, now. The Sendril are one of the most common non-human races you'll find in the depths below. They have a rather large settlement on floor 217, and there are pockets of them elsewhere. So you're some kind of dweller hybrid? I asked. Jacob snorted and rolled his eyes. It's like talking with a child. He sighed. The Sendril aren't human, but that doesn't mean they're dwellers, he said in a clipped tone. And you should know they will be very offended indeed if you suggest otherwise. The progenitor ship has been stuck in our dimension for quite some time, but you must understand that Earth wasn't its first stop. From what I've been able to piece together, we were supposed to have been the last. Would have been, if not for the blight. The ship picked up a wide assortment of different races before it ever docked with our world, he continued in earnest. There are Sendrils, obviously, he gestured at himself with a reptilian, claw-tipped hand, but there are also nymph shades, Celestari, Koboks, Drenar, Eclipotors, Helionites, Irids, Mistivores, and Chromalkans, and those are just the big ones. Transmogs are delvers who voluntarily splice their genetic material with another race. I squinted at him. Wait, let me see if I have the gist of it, I prodded. You were human, but now you're a lizard guy. With scales. And horns. And claws. And presumably other, unmentionable lizard anatomical bits? Yes, to all of the above, he replied flatly. Though I would prefer not to talk about the rest of my anatomical bits, If you don't mind. And you did this willingly? Yes, he agreed. I sighed and rubbed at one temple. But why? I asked after a long beat. What in the world would make you want to trade in your humanity? He shrugged. Humanity isn't all it's cracked up to be. As to why I did it. Why do you do anything in the back rooms? To survive, of course. As difficult as it might be to believe, when it comes to the vast expanse of intradimensional reality, we humans aren't at the top of the survival food chain. There are a great many things that are faster, stronger, and more durable. Even here on Earth, we are physically outmatched by almost all other apex species in almost every metric, save one. Intelligence. He let the word float in the air, heavy like a thundercloud. But if you were to give bears human levels of intelligence, he continued after a moment, do you truly think man would still rule our world? He grimaced and shook his head. Doubtful. Many of these other races offer additional benefits and bonuses, and this one suited my spatial core build particularly well. Assuming you really are new, and this isn't all some elaborate scheme, then you might want to consider it at some point yourself. There are variant helix splicers down in the research labs below, though getting to them can be, he faltered, challenging. Good to know, I said, cataloging that detail away for later. The idea of trading in my humanity was extremely unpalatable, but would I do it if it meant surviving? Maybe. Though I couldn't say before the option was on the table in front of me. You've been extremely helpful, so as a small thank you, I'll give you 10% off on your entire order. There is no need for that, the Central replied formally, waving away my offer. I don't need any of your frivolous provisions or any of your subpar relics. All I want is elixirs. Health, mana, stamina. I'll take the whole lot of them. I was trying to explain that to your horrifying pony golem, but she insisted the elixirs are capped at 3 per customer. Sorry, that's store policy, I replied. We want to keep some in stock for other customers. No, Jacob said matter-of-factly, that simply will not do at all. You're charging a ridiculously paltry fee, and I am prepared to pay well above market value for the entirety of your stock. He held up a clawed finger. 1 common grade relic per elixir. But, in exchange, I want all that you have available. I nearly choked at his offer. A straight-up one-to-one trade? For elixirs? Holy shit, but it felt like I'd just hit the jackpot. I didn't even need to check the binder to know that we had a total of 60 elixirs on hand, 20 of all 3 varieties. I had even more in my personal storage, though I wasn't willing to part with those. They were my emergency stash for when things went sideways, as they invariably did. But if I was really to part with all 60, that meant 60 relics. Even if they were all trashed here, with no redeeming qualities whatsoever, I could still sacrifice them and boost a bunch of my best abilities straight through the roof. Although I was already salivating at the possibilities, I didn't immediately jump on the man's offer. If he was willing to waltz right in and drop 60 common grade relics for elixirs without even batting an eye, then it meant I was missing something important. Maybe these potions were rarer and more valuable than I'd first assumed. Or maybe elixirs acted as currency in other places and this guy was trying to pull one over on me. Sure, taking the deal would be great in the short term, but maybe it would end up biting me in the ass down the road. That's an extremely generous offer, I replied after mulling it over for a bit longer, but I'm still inclined to say no. I watched as his shoulders bunched and a thread of anger wormed its way across his face. Unless you tell me why you're willing to pay so much for them, I amended. Seems like elixirs should be easy enough to come by, especially for someone as high level as you. Which makes me think that your offer might not be as generous as it first appears. Jacob of Grief stared at me as though trying to decide what to do with me. After a few long seconds, his shoulders slumped, and he seemed to relax just a hair. He exhaled and it was a heavy sound. You would think procuring elixirs is a trivial matter, but in that you would be quite wrong. Dwellers rarely if ever drop them, which means there are essentially only 2 ways to obtain them. The first is by earning mythic loot tokens. In the early stages, Such tokens can be quite easy to come by because they often are awarded with new research achievements. Unfortunately, the longer you're here, the harder it is to unlock additional achievements, which means the fewer loot token rewards you get, overall. Unless, of course, you are willing to take increasingly suicidal job board posts, which most of us are not. And that means the best way to get elixirs is to farm locations that regenerate them. He paused and glanced around. Such as this one, I am assuming. But these locations are also surprisingly rare. The third floor is one of the most diverse, because of its theme, and has a great many resources, which makes it a popular hunting ground. Still not seeing a problem, I said, restlessly drumming my fingers on the edge of the counter. Why not just find a location that spawns elixirs and then raid it every couple weeks? The problem is the Black Harbor Syndicate, Jacob replied stiffly, whose toes you are unwittingly stepping on. They are a criminal collective, of sorts, who operate with some degree of impunity in almost every single safe harbor. And, as it happens, the farming, distribution, and sale of all elixirs falls under their exclusive purview. I looked at Croc, who was reclining in a folding chair in a very undog-like fashion. Did you know about this Black Harbor Syndicate? I asked quietly. Well yeah, the dog said, crossing its legs. Who doesn't know about the syndicate? Me, I growled. I don't know about the syndicate. Why didn't you mention that earlier? Like maybe when we were going over the pricing model for the elixirs. The mimic looked at me, puzzled. But Dan, how am I supposed to know what you do and don't know? You didn't ask about the syndicate or whether selling elixirs was illegal, so I just assumed you had some awesome plan, because you always have an awesome plan. I pressed my eyes shut tightly and took a few deep breaths through my nose. This sounds like a classic case of miscommunication, Croc said, and I think we can all agree that no one is to blame, especially not me. Croc, who is a good boy that just wants to be helpful. It was impossible to stay mad at the mimic, even though it felt like I'd just got sucker punched in the teeth. From now on, Croc, just assume that I don't know anything if you haven't told me, I said. Croc's googly eyes got strangely large and the dog looked incredibly serious all of a sudden. Oh, fiddlesticks. That is a huge responsibility, Dan. I'm not even sure where to begin. Do you know how to read? We could start there, I suppose. Or maybe we should have the birds and the bees talk. I read about that in Paperbacks and Paradoxes. Honestly, I was very confused about the whole thing, but I'll do my best to explain why the daddy bees wrestle with the mommy birds. About the backrooms, Croc, I interrupted. I 100% don't need you to explain the birds and the bees to me. Wow, that is such a relief, Croc replied, clearly relieved. But since we're on the topic, I don't suppose you could explain it to me, then. Because, again, the whole premise was very confusing. Birds and bees seem like natural enemies, so them forming an alliance like that seems oddly out of character. Unless. The mimic trailed off. Unless it's a bit like Edward and Bella, from the best-selling and beloved by all Twilight series, setting aside their differences to explore the wonders of forbidden love. Is that the answer, Dan? I ignored the dog and turned back to Jacob. So, you were saying about this syndicate? The Sindel glanced between me and Croc, confusion clear in his gaze. I was saying that you are courting trouble, he said. They have an unofficial decree granted by the sovereigns, who all receive sizable kickbacks from the syndicate in exchange for turning a blind eye to their dealings. Collecting elixirs from a raid or from the loot arcade is permissible, but they can only be used for personal consumption. Reselling them is strictly off limits. First offense, you lose a finger or two. The second time it's the whole hand. Then they start taking off progressively larger body parts. So, you're hoping to get all the elixirs I have before the syndicate shuts me down and starts taking appendages, I said. Jine, he acknowledged with a dip of his chin. Just my fucking luck. Not only was I actively at war with the skinless court, but now I had to worry about these monopolistic douchebags from the Black Harbor Syndicate breaking my fingers or amputating body parts. At this point, it seemed like the Skillless Court and the Syndicate were going to have to fight over who got to murder me first. I could also take Jacob's warning to heart and avoid the wrath of the Syndicate altogether by simply not selling elixirs, but, well, I didn't want to. Not only did I dislike shithead bullies, but I wasn't about to kneecap my business before it even got off the ground. And if elixirs really were in such short supply, this would only drive even more customers to my store. That did mean tangling with the folks from the Syndicate, but in for a penny, in for a pound, as my granddad used to say. Besides, maybe I could cut a deal with the Syndicate, or, worst case scenario, I'd restrict their access to the store just like I'd done with the dickbag aspirants who rallied beneath the flayed monarch's banner. Okay, I said, I'm willing to part with a whole lot for one common grade relic apiece, but since I'm likely signing my own death warrant by selling you these things, I'm thinking maybe you could add something else to help sweeten the pot. Jacob considered it only for a few seconds, before agreeing. That seems like a fair concession, considering the risks involved on your end. Because I am a man of honor, I'll give you a one-for-one swap, plus I'll toss in an extremely useful uncommon grade relic that should make you a little more durable. Do we have a deal? 60 commons, plus an uncommon relic? All for a resource that I'd be able to regenerate in a span of 2 days. I'd be crazy not to take that deal. I grinned and extended my hand once more. Hell yeah, we do, partner. Chapter 33. I handed over a duffel bag worth of elixirs to Jacob, and he headed off to one of the tents in the back, compliments of the house, for a peaceful night of rest and relaxation, while I spent the next few hours sorting through the enormous pile of relics he had unceremoniously dumped onto the front counter. As expected, most of them were complete garbage, fit only for sacrificing. Elevator music conjured elevator music for 30 seconds, cost 40 mana, and had no combat effect whatsoever. Selfie sense was a bit like my sixth sense ability, but instead of locating traps, it allowed the user to detect the perfect lighting and angle conditions for snapping a selfie. I couldn't imagine a single use for a skill like that and wondered why it even existed. There were a handful of gems in there, though, including half a dozen basic combo kits and 2 sucker punches. I forged another Mall Ninja's Strike and added it to the store's available relic inventory, along with the rest of the combo kits and the other sucker punch. There was also a common grade called Arsonist Accelerant, which took the form of a cheap grocery store squirt gun. Except it was filled with lighter fluid. Although it didn't have an active damage component, it could conjure a large puddle of lighter fluid that increased all fire damage by 100%. It had extremely high synergy with the Erlenmeyer's Molotov cocktail relic, and I forged the two together, creating an uncommon relic called Burn, Baby, Burn. It effectively turned the Molotov cocktail into a flamethrower spell, allowing the caster to unleash a wild jet of continuous flame for as long as they had mana to burn. It dealt a shit ton of burst damage and did decent dot as well, but it came with a few significant drawbacks that made me hold off adding it to my core. Burn, Baby, Burn. Uncommon relic, level 1. Range, single target. Cost, 2 mana seconds. Ever wonder what burning hair smells like? Now, you'll know. Unleash a reckless column of purifying flame and cleanse the world of its many, many transgressions. Let it burn, baby, burn. The target takes 30 points of flame damage on contact, and an additional 5 points of damage per second while the opponent is directly in the flame stream. But there are drawbacks. Do you know what the life expectancy of a flamethrower operator in Vietnam was? 4 minutes. Yours probably won't be much longer. While actively using Burn, Baby, Burn, you are rooted in place and unable to move. You receive 2 points of flame damage per second while using this skill. If actively using Burn, Baby, Burn while your health is below 10%, you have a 25% chance of spontaneously exploding, just like the flamethrower operators in NAM. This relic enables mana usage. The drawbacks were horrendous, so much so that I didn't even want to sell the damned thing, but if I could forge it with another relic that mitigated some of the god-awful side effects, it might be a real contender down the road. The single uncommon Jacob had given me to sweeten the pot ended up being a physical relic that was too good to ignore. It also addressed one of the fundamental problems with my current abilities. I was weak as a newborn kitten. I dumped the vast majority of my personal enhancement points into resonance, perception, and grit. Although, in theory, I was already significantly stronger than even the strongest human athlete, compared to the things in the backrooms I was like a toddler swinging around a pool noodle. On top of that, I had a serious glass jaw thanks to my low toughness score. The uncommon great relic Jacob had given me wouldn't solve all of my problems, but it definitely lived up to the hype. Even better, because I hadn't harvested it from a dead dweller, it retained all the levels Jacob had already imbued it with. Baldry's Scale Male Kairas. Uncommon Relic, Level 7. Range, Self-Passive. Is this just the chest cavity of a dead Sendril? That's not important right now. What is important about this ribcage chest cavity is that it'll imbue your frail, squishy meat sack with a sliver of the Sendril racial bonuses without having to run your body through the DNA equivalent of an industrial wood chipper. While equipped, this scale male Kairas, which may or may not have been harvested from a poor schlub named Travius of Baldry, grants the user +1 toughness per 2 variant assimilation level and offers an additional 10% resistance against all sources of magical damage. Unfortunately, the Sendril suck so profoundly at magic that their suckage has even seeped into this odd relic. While equipped, you lose +1 point of resonance per 5 variant assimilation levels. Even accounting for the penalty against resonance, equipping the Kairas, which did indeed look like the hollowed out, scale-covered torso of a Sendril, was a no-brainer. An extra 10% resistance against all forms of magic? Fuck yeah. Plus, I'd gain 7 points of toughness, while sacrificing only 3 points of resonance? Sign me up. Deciding which relic to get rid of was a little tougher. Bad Trip was a solid control technique, and Slippery when wet had proved to be surprisingly effective more times than I could count. The best option was to replace Tinfoil Hat of Mind Shielding, which would cost me a point of grit, plus the slight protection it offered against Hypnotic Sonics. I hung on to the Tinfoil Hat, though, since I could always swap it back and if I found myself squaring off against a dweller that primarily dealt in mindfuckery, like the Photophage. After sorting through the relics, forging those worth forging, and separating out those worth selling, I had 43 common great relics fit for the burn heap. Since my Drano Bolt had hit the level 5 advancement threshold, the cost to level the ability had increased from 5 to 10 relics per level. With 40 relics to burn, I could have pushed it up to level 9, but instead I decided to raise a few of my other abilities up to the first advancement threshold, which would give me the most bang for my buck. The Sendril Scale Male was already at level 7, so I ignored that one, and instead sacrificed 10 relics to bring Sterilization Field from level 3 up to level 5. The effect wasn't nearly as exciting as I'd been hoping for, though still not bad. The total aura duration increased to 30 seconds and the mana cost decreased by 10 points, from 50 to 40. It also added an additional effect. While I was actively inside the aura field, all my mana costs were reduced by 10%. Good, but not nearly as flashy as the changes to Drano Bolt. I used 15 to boost Mall Ninja's strike to level 4 and the last 15 to bring the Pharmacist's scales up from level 2 to level 5. The advancement didn't change the core mechanic of the relic in any way, it still allowed me to exchange mana for health or health for mana in equal measure, but now I could extend the effect to others, instead of just myself, which would be handy to have. Even more so now that I knew about the whole elixir situation. I spent some time tinkering around with the monolith, distributing the 15 personal enhancement points I'd racked up over the past 2 weeks. I dropped 2 points into athleticism, increasing my attack speed and damage, a single point into grit, making up for the point I'd lost by removing the tinfoil hat, then put 5 more into perception and the remaining 7 into resonance. For my level, I was still critically weak when it came to physical damage output, but overall, things were looking up. Dan Woodridge. Specimen biotag ID number 03A-01-B00R7T569C. Variant assimilation level, 15. Race, human, archetypal. Current experience, 16,370. Next level, 19,250. Personal enhancement points, 0. ____________. Health, 69. Health regen hour, 3.25. _______________. Stamina reserve, 36. Stamina regen minute, 2.7. ______________. Mana pool, 89. Mana regen minute, 6.35. Individual adaptive stats. Grit, 10. Athleticism, 10. Toughness, 16. Perception, 20. Resonance, 34. Preservation, 5. Spatial core, active. C. Moving workway, level 1. C. Slippery when wet, level 1. C. Force multiplier, level 1. C. The pharmacist scales, level 5. U. Mall ninja's strike, level 3. U. Bad trip, level 1. U. Baldry scale Malka Iras, level 7. R. Sterilization field, level 5. R. Drano bolt, level 5. Me. Compass of the Catacomber, fully tempered. Current titles, passive. Out of your league, Death Wish, marked for death, weapon of opportunity, legend in the making, overkill overlord, fish in a barrel. I caught a few hours of shut-eye after that, since Croc and I had been pounding the metaphorical pavement non-stop for what felt like forever. When I woke up, I was still tired but significantly less so than I'd been before. I headed over to the break room with a trio of microwavable hot pockets, well, magma calzones, technically, in tow, and found Croc and Jacob lounging together at the circular table, a half-demolished plate of chicken wings sitting between them. Jacob was picking the wings clean with his razor-sharp teeth, and Croc was then swallowing the bones down whole. Just slurping them into a stomach that didn't seem to exist. The Reptilian Central had a half-full beer propped up on the table, condensation beating on the glass. "Good morning," the lizard man said, lifting his bottle and offering me a small salute. "Is it morning?" I asked, squinting bleary-eyed at him. "In the back rooms," the man replied evenly, "it is whatever time you want it to be. You just woke up, so for you it is morning. I wanted a beer, so for me, it is evening." He paused and regarded the glass in his hand. "I find that it is usually evening for me, these days. I never was much of a drinker before coming here, but now it is one of the few pleasures I have left." "Amen to that, brother," I said, before popping the hot pockets into the microwave, then setting them to whirling as I hit the start button. "Looks like it's 5 o'clock for me too, so how's about you grab me a beer?" "Of course," Jacob replied, fishing one out from the employee's fridge, then popping the cap off with a claw. He slid it across the table toward me with ease, not spilling a single sud in the process. I plopped into a chair opposite him and took a long swig, enjoying the flavor of the brew. At least the beer was good here. And plentiful. "So your compatriot and I," he nodded toward Croc, "have been discussing this enterprise you have started, and I think your idea might have some merit. How exactly it is you've come by this place is still a mystery, and one I won't press you to divulge, but with all of this advertising you are going to attract some powerful interest very quickly if you haven't already." "And?" I asked, cutting him off. "What's it to you? I thought you were just trying to scoop up all the elixirs you could get before the syndicate cuts my hands off and feeds me to the shit golem on the second floor." "No. Indeed, I was," he replied, dipping his chin slightly, "but I've had some time to ponder your situation. The truth is, I think the service you can potentially provide would be of tremendous value to a great many delvers, just like me. Is this vision of yours likely to work?" "No." "Is it suicidal?" "Yes, almost certainly." "And yet," he trailed off, "and yet I find myself both curious and rooting for your success. Which is why I want to offer you a little advice. The microwave dinged, punctuating his words. "That's awfully considerate of you," I said, retrieving my magma calzones, which were roughly the surface temperature of the sun. "And I suppose you're doing that out of the goodness of your heart?" "Do not be obtuse, it is beneath you," Jacob replied. "I am doing it because if you succeed it will benefit me greatly. Much like you, I am an outsider. Not fully accepted by the Centrals below, since I am a transmog, but not fully accepted by the human settlements for the same reason. Plus, I already have plenty of bad blood with the skinless court. As a result, finding reliable allies can be tricky, but this place. It could be something truly fantastic, but only if you survive long enough to make it so." "I'm listening," I said, absently tracing a finger along the slick exterior of my beer bottle. "You're moving too slow," he said. "How the hell are we supposed to move any faster?" I asked, mildly annoyed. "It's true," Croc added, seeming to sense my frustration. "We've been out canvassing levels for 16 hours a day. Sometimes more. The only way I can see it going faster is if we recruit Princess Pennypuff, an idea I am not particularly keen on, or if Dan finds a way to shed his frail, fleshly need for sleep. I have no doubt you are working tirelessly, but it will not be enough," the Central said, shaking his head. "The marketing, it is creative, perhaps even a stroke of genius. Again, how you are accomplishing such a feat given the nature of the backrooms is a baffling conundrum, but that is not the point." "And your point is what, exactly?" I pressed. "That you are overtly drawing attention to yourself, but do not yet have any worthwhile allies, discounting dear Croc and those nightmarish golems working the floor. But they will hardly be enough, considering who your adversaries are. Especially once the Syndicate gets word about your activities. It's like you've installed a neon sign telling everyone who might want you dead exactly where to find you." "Huh. I wondered if we could get an actual neon sign. That would be a hell of a lot more eye-catching than the spray paint." "The doorway anchors act as temporal restriction fields," I said dismissively. "I can keep out those shit weasels from the Skinless Court, and if the douches from the Syndicate get froggy I can ban their asses too. And what is to stop them from simply setting up a cordon around each of your little doors, huh?" he asked. "Will you just stay in here forever? I love how you're laying out all the problems, and not giving me any solutions to work with," I shot back. There was a mischievous twinkle in his eye. "That is only because I have yet to finish. You see, Geffard, I approve of what you're doing, but to speed things along, you need to post one of these doorways of yours in a proper safe harbor, preferably one without ties to the Syndicate. And there is only one I can think of within your reach. Howler's Hold, down on floor 7. That wasn't the first time I'd heard their name. The researcher mentioned Howler's Hold in one of his prompts, I said, picking at the hot pocket and shoving the cooler bits into my mouth. "You received more than one prompt from the researcher?" Jacob asked quietly, more for himself than for me. Curiouser and curiouser. He eyed me and rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "But never mind, one mystery at a time is more than enough. Howler's Hold is run by a rather, shall we say, eccentric group of like-minded individuals, but they also happen to be quite powerful. They can be a little standoffish toward outsiders, but of all the communities, they are the most likely to render aid to outcasts and new delvers just trying to find their way. You happen to be both, a new delver and an outcast. And their standoffishness might actually be a benefit in this situation. Although they have a ruling council of sorts, which resides in a hidden enclave somewhere below the 100th floor, they don't owe allegiance to any sovereign and their safe harbors are among the only ones where the Syndicate doesn't operate freely. So I wouldn't have to worry about the aspirants of the court or Syndicate thugs?" I asked. "I didn't say that," Jacob cut in sharply. "I said the Syndicate doesn't operate freely. There will certainly be Syndicate members lurking in the shadows. But they will keep their allegiance hidden. That means more knives in the dark. But there will be far fewer of them, and they won't have the blessing of the harbor itself. Making an ally out of the Howlers might prove to be difficult, at least initially, but if you could secure a trading partnership with them, it would certainly boost the prospect of your long-term survival." As he spoke, I thought about the fabled artifact I had tucked away inside my storage space. The seal of the researcher. I could only use it once, but assuming the researcher held sway with the delvers of the hold, then maybe setting up shop wouldn't be as tough as Jacob thought. Not that I was going to divulge any of that information to him. If you would like, he said after a moment, I could, perhaps, make an introduction for you. Although I am not a standing member of the hold, they've always treated me with a great deal of kindness. Friendliness even, which is saying quite a lot, since this is a world where friendship doesn't exist. I felt the hairs stand up along the back of my neck, almost as though Spelunker's sixth sense had activated. This had nothing to do with magic, though, and everything to do with gut instinct. Maybe this guy was really on the level, or maybe he was being useful with an ulterior motive in mind. Like getting me out of the store then turning me over to the flayed monarch. Or, more likely, killing me the second I was an easy target, and looting every single relic from my spatial core. And what's to stop you from ripping my head off the second we leave this place? I asked bluntly. You're level 25. I wouldn't last 2 minutes against you if you decided to kill me. The man just grinned. Maybe you will survive here after all. So long as you assume that everything, everywhere, all the time is both lying to you and trying to murder you? I finished. Exactly, he agreed, practically beaming. And what would you say if I asked to stay a while longer in this store of yours? As long as you can afford to pay for a room and follow the posted rules, don't steal shit, don't harass my golems, don't break anything, you're welcome to stay as long as you'd like. I'll have another shipment of elixirs ready by next week. He pulled out a silver delver token and slid it across the table toward me. Excellent. Put me down for a week, in the private tent of course. Of course, I said, pocketing the coin. Chapter 34. You know, I like that Jacob, Croc said as we exited through the sliding glass doors by the front register. That doesn't mean anything, I replied. You like everyone. That is true on a fair point, but this time I really feel it. Like the warmth I feel in my belly after eating someone. It just feels right, you know? Having never eaten anyone, I do not know. But I'll take your word for it. I paused and stole a sidelong look at the dog. Thing is, Croc, we need to be careful about people like Jacob. He seemed like a straight shooter to me too, but he could be playing us. He can't hurt us inside the store, but the second we leave, we're fair game. For now, the only people we can trust is ourselves. Because we're friends, Dan? Croc asked. And friends stuck together forever and would never lie, betray, or eat one another. Bingo, I replied. Besides, we don't need Jacob. We can find Howler's Hold ourselves. We know it's somewhere on the 7th floor, and with an unerring arrow, we'll get there eventually. Instead of exiting directly into the sprawling expanse of the 3rd floor, we found ourselves in a large shipping elevator. The kind they use to move cargo around shopping malls. Running down a sleek silver panel on the right were buttons that corresponded to each of the various doorway anchors I'd planted so far. There were 5 buttons in total, 1 for the lobby in each of the first 3 floors, plus a 5th button that simply read VIP. That button was only accessible by me. The curious thing was, I hadn't intentionally added the elevator using my blanket fort ability. It had just sort of shown up after I planted the 2nd doorway anchor. Apparently, it was the backroom's logistical solution for one door that had many entrances and exits. I thumbed the VIP button and the elevator rumbled and vibrated as though great, invisible cables were hauling us up into the abyss. After a few seconds there was a ding and the doorway slid open with a smooth whisper. Croc and I stepped out through an unremarkable gray janitorial door, set in a beige service hallway on the 3rd floor. The door clicked shut behind us, taking with it the view of the overlarge interior of the elevator. Curiously, if I were to step through the doorway again, it wouldn't take me to the elevator at all, but through the sliding glass doors and directly into the store. It was a weird bit of spatial magic that hurt my brain to think about. It was a good thing overall, though, because it meant that if delvers wanted to use the storefront as a means of traversing between floors, they'd have to pay for the privilege first. I turned around and ran my fingers over the black plastic faceplate, which simply read Private Service Access Point, and tugged it off with a thought and a small trickle of mana. The placard served as my private VIP doorway anchor, and unlike the others, I could move it freely with no time or placement restrictions. With the faceplate now tucked away in storage, the door would legitimately connect to a janitor's closet. One filled with a level 6 amorphous ooze that breathed out toxic chlorine gas. I fixed the 7th floor firmly in my mind and cast unerring arrow, conjuring the ghostly blue arrow that shot down the corridor to the left. It quickly disappeared into another door that led to what Croc had dubbed a double-decker stairwell, meaning it connected both to the floor directly above us and to one of the floors below. This particular stairwell was extra useful, however, since it skipped the 4th floor entirely and led out directly onto the 5th. Finding stairwells was hard enough, but finding stairwells that jumped floors was like finding an uncut diamond in a pile of horseshit. In hindsight, I'd been damned lucky to come across the janitorial bathroom guardian, even though it had nearly killed me in the process. I unlocked the metal push bar using the same key I'd taken off the janitor so long ago and shouldered my way into the stairwell. I took a quick glance around to make sure the way was still clear and that nothing nasty had set up shop since we'd last scoped out this location. Then Croc and I headed down 2 simple sets of concrete steps. The descent was remarkably anticlimactic, which was fine by me. Even though Croc and I had discovered the double-decker stairwell almost a week ago, this was the first time I'd actually ventured below the 3rd floor. Croc had told me in endless detail about what to expect, but it still caught me by surprise as the door swung open and we stumbled out into what I could only describe as a 1920s luxury hotel. Gaudy gold and crystal chandeliers dangled from frescoed ceilings, casting warm buttery light across polished marble floors. The soft, distant sounds of a piano drifted through the air, mingling with the muffled chatter of unseen patrons. Crushed velvet drapes framed grand arched windows that looked out into nowhere, while plush armchairs, ornate tapestries, and gilded mirrors hinted at an era of unparalleled luxury. Although I didn't see anything or anyone, it was impossible to miss the earthy scent of cigars waltzing with a hint of floral perfume. The place wasn't my style, not even close, but I'd spent time with people who would pay an arm and a leg to stay in a hotel this fancy. Hell, me and the boys had worked on a renovation job up in Cincinnati that strongly reminded me of this place, and I knew for a fact that even the low-end rooms went for $400 or more a night. There was nothing in the world that would convince me to pay that much for a place to sleep. I'd slept in tents, under the stars, and on top of honest-to-God tank treads, and there wasn't anything a $400 a night room could do for me that a bed down at the Motel 6 couldn't accomplish. Still, assuming things went well with the folks in Howler's Hold, maybe I'd venture back up here and snag a block of rooms to graft onto the store. It would give visitors a little more space, and I could charge quite a bit more for a luxury suite than I could for a tent or a cot in the storage area behind the freezers. I planted a standard doorway anchor on a gilded door that led into an empty guest room with a king-sized bed and a boxy TV that buzzed with fuzzy black and white static. With the anchor set, I'd be able to come back here and look around at my leisure once I'd finished taking care of business with the settlers in Howler's Hold. We didn't spend much time exploring the 5th floor. An unerring arrow quickly spirited us not toward a stairwell, as I'd first assumed, but toward a dumbwaiter that dropped us down onto the 6th floor, which was utterly and completely dark. Crawling out of the cramped box, barely large enough to accommodate my bulk, and into a pitch-black room was an unnerving experience. I pulled the high-powered mag light from my tool belt, but the watery beam of light was about as effective as farting into the wind. The darkness seemed to be a living thing that ate the light after only a handful of feet. I pulled a secondary flashlight from storage, hoping that the extra beam would somehow reduce the oppressive nature of the hungry dark. It didn't help at all. Not a lick. When I dropped to a knee and examined the ground beneath me, I saw pitted concrete, which suggested this was an indoor location of some variety. Past that, though, there were no distinguishable features of note. But there was a sound in the darkness. The howl of a distant wind blowing through the branches of a leafless winter tree. There didn't seem to be any dwellers to speak of, but the longer we stayed the more I felt the weight of unseen eyes watching me from every corner. Not that there were corners, or walls, or rooms. This wasn't a twisting labyrinth like the lobby or even the endless urban sprawl of the third floor. This was a void place. A realm of complete emptiness, barren of anything that could conceivably be used for survival. There was just nothing. Hell, I couldn't even locate a monolith. Not one that existed on this floor, at any rate. When I asked Croc about the discrepancy, the mimic merely shrugged. Of course there aren't monoliths, the dog replied as though it were common knowledge, intuitively known by all. Lots of people think the 6th floor isn't a proper floor at all. This is superspace. Or maybe subspace. No one seems to agree on which exactly. Far as I can reckon, there are about half a dozen of these floors scattered throughout the back rooms. The 6th floor. The 103rd. 232. 349. Those are the ones I'm reasonably sure about. If they are not real floors, then what in the hell are they and why do they exist? I asked, still scanning the darkness, looking for threats that weren't there. Now that is the question, isn't it? Croc replied sagely. Why does anything exist, Dan? Who am I? Why am I here? What is my purpose, am I right? I grimaced and pinched the bridge of my nose. I can appreciate that it seems like you're having an existential crisis right now, but I'm not talking metaphorically. Like if this place isn't a proper floor, why is it in the back rooms? But that's what I'm trying to get at, Dan. No one knows. That's the thing you have to understand about this place. No one really knows anything. About anything. At all. Except maybe the researcher, but there's a good chance he's insane now, so even he's probably not an entirely reliable source. And that's assuming you could find him, which you can't. Or that he'll talk to you even if you did, which he won't. We're all just taking a wild, blind stab in the dark. I've heard other delvers say these floors are like connective tissue. Or quantum glue, maybe. Croc paused, wrinkling its nose. I'll be honest, I don't actually know what quantum glue is, but there was this delver named Mikkel who said it and it sounded really smart. He was some sort of scientist or something before he ended up here. But now that I hear myself say it aloud, it sounds kinda dumb. What happened to Mikkel? I asked because I always had to ask. Maybe if I survived impending execution at the hands of the flayed monarch, I'd take some time to chronicle all of the countless deaths Croc had witnessed. 1,000 ways to die in the back rooms, I'd call it. Croc's face fell. Mikkel didn't last long, but I want to go on record and say that was not my fault. He was in bad shape before he ever got here. Some sort of accident with something called the Large Hadron Collider. Croc leaned in close. Not sure who Hadron is or why he's so large, but he must have been one mean fella. Mikkel's organs were all mixed up on the inside. Honestly, I'm surprised he made it as long as he did, considering the circumstances. But he was an interesting case, since he's the only delver I ever meet who bypassed the lobby entirely and clipped straight to level 5, which is where I found him. His lungs were on the outside of his body. Does that mean he died of natural causes? I asked. Croc just laughed for a good solid minute. The sound was oddly muted in the dark. Eventually it wiped a tear from the edge of a googly eye with one paw. Natural causes. That's funny, Dan. It's good to see you haven't lost your sense of humor yet. That usually goes pretty quickly for most delvers. We walked for another hour or so, accompanied only by the sound of our muffled footfalls and the rustle of the distant breeze that never abated, but never drew any closer either. I cast an unerring arrow every 10 minutes or so, but the arrow always pointed straight ahead. Even when I turned around and cast the spell a second time, I got the sense that direction didn't matter at all here. I wasn't even sure direction existed. Eventually, my flashlight beam reflected off a freestanding metal door, jutting up from the floor. It wasn't connected to anything at all. No walls. Not even a proper door frame. Croc and I circled it 3 times, scanning for traps. But it was just a freestanding door. When I cast an unerring arrow, The ethereal trail of light curved around the door and seemed to disappear into its backside. Because I couldn't leave well enough alone, I tried the door from the front side and thought my jaw might hit the floor as it swung open to reveal the sweltering interior of a machine shop on the second floor. I shut the door quickly, before anything nasty could lumber through and ruin my day, then tried entering from the other side. This time the door swung open, revealing what appeared to be a dilapidated elementary classroom. The room lay in ruins. The tile floors were scuffed, chipped, and covered in a thick layer of dust and flaking plaster. Ancient desks, crafted from rusty iron and moldering wood, were haphazardly scattered about the room, many overturned as though the former occupants had left in a hurry. They were small, those desks, and wouldn't fit anyone larger than an HE-year-old. Looming at the front of the classroom like a wounded buffalo was a significantly larger desk, crafted from rich mahogany. A wooden ruler sat on the desktop, and beside it was a heap of crimson rosary beads. Behind the heavy desk was a weathered green chalkboard, its cracked and pitted surface covered by a list of rules, written in tight, white cursive lettering. Good children are seen but never heard. The best children are never seen at all. Good boys and girls always say their prayers, or they will be taken by the left leg and thrown down the stairs. When the bell tolls thrice, return to your chambers. You know why. At 3 a.m. the sacred hour begins. Stay in bed, eyes shut tight. No matter what you hear, do not leave your room. Obedient children will avoid the mirrors. It is as it ever was and so shall ever be. Good boys and girls avoid the indulgent temptations of the partygoers. The cake is a lie. The cake bearer, the father of lies. Children who avoid their studies and stay too long at the playground will receive delicious penance. What the fuck is wrong with this place? I thought as I scanned the list of rules, trying to commit each one to memory. Were they here solely to scare the absolute bejesus out of anyone who stumbled across them? Probably. Unless they weren't. And these rules were so incredibly weird and specific, I had to assume they were in some way a warning. Or at least a glimpse into whatever dangers this creepy place held. Croc slipped into the room behind me, and the door we'd entered through closed with an audible click, which seemed thunderous in the stillness of the abandoned classroom. On instinct, I turned around and tried the handle. It opened with ease, but now it no longer led to the yawning darkness of the 6th floor, but rather revealed a small supply closet filled with a heap of old papers, covered with the faded scribblings of children. I crouched down and snatched up a sheet of construction paper with a crude scene sketched in crayon. There was a little stick figure kid with a wide grin holding up what appeared to be a birthday cake covered with a ridiculous number of candles. The stick figure was in some sort of party room with balloons, and standing behind the figure was the lanky form of a clown in a bright yellow suit. The clown had tufts of red hair poking out and a smile that stretched beyond the bounds of its face. I shuddered and let the drawing flutter back to the discarded heap. If there was one thing I disliked even more than furries, it was clowns. And with the furries, it wasn't a moral judgment. They just made me uncomfortable. But with clowns? I specifically and actively thought less of anyone who, of sound mind and their own volition, decided that being a clown was a good and appropriate life choice. I'm guessing this is the 7th floor? I asked, stealing a look at Croc. Of course. It's the school zone. Although sometimes people call this place level fun, on account of all the arcades. I thought you said each quadrant had one monolith and one loot arcade. Except for level 6, which doesn't have any, I amended. Yeah, but the loot arcades here are enormous. They are actually larger than any other loot arcade above the 100th floor, and they offer a better selection of prizes, too. That's why Howler's Hold is here. This is one of the best levels for resource access. Why do I feel like there's a bit coming? I said, forehead furrowing in suspicion. Because I was about to add one, the mimic replied sheepishly. This is one of the best levels for resources access, but the trade-off is that the Fun Zone arcades are also among the most dangerous and well-defended. Lots of dwellers. Lots of blighted areas. On floor 3, the arcades are clear 80% of the time, but here, it's the exact opposite. More danger, but proportionally bigger rewards. We talkin' murder muncher levels of danger here? I asked. Or worse, Croc said happily. But I'm sure we won't have a problem, Dan. You've got all your fancy navigator abilities, so I fully expect nothing bad whatsoever to happen to us in any way. Which is precisely when we heard the melodic giggle of a child. Chapter 35. Hammer firmly in hand, Croc and I slipped out of the dilapidated classroom and into an equally run-down hallway with green walls, so pale they were almost white. There was ample debris scattered along the floor, bits of plaster, old soda cans, crumpled sheets of notebook paper, and the overhead lights dimmed and flickered in signature backrooms fashion. The giggle of children came again, closer this time. The eerie sound sent goosebumps crawling along my arms. I focused on the mini-map in the corner of my eye and zoomed in, looking for any sign of hostile dwellers. Despite the ominous child giggles, however, the map showed nothing but me and Croc. I dismissed the map and surveyed the hallway, which branched off with one path heading left and another going right. To the right, the hallway continued straight as an arrow, going for so long that eventually it just faded from view. The left-hand path connected to a T-intersection, branching left and right once more. Rows of rusty lockers adorned the left-hand corridor. A few of them were closed, but most hung open at odd angles, concealing pools of shadow. Anything could have been hiding in those things, and my spelunker's sixth sense quickly lit up, highlighting several of the lockers with a hazy red aura. Traps, though what kind I wasn't sure. Scrawled on the wall, directly across from the rusted lockers, was a faded cartoonish mural, which had clearly been made by an army of small children. Or at least painted to look that way. There were several figures lined up in a lime-green meadow with a huge yellow sun overhead. There was a gaggle of stick-figure kids, each drawn to scale. They wore triangular dresses or boxy, square pants and shirts, marking each one as a little girl or a little boy. The figures had large black eyes and crooked smiles that ran across round faces in odd ways. Standing at their center was an image of the same nightmare clown I'd seen on the discarded paper in the classroom. Tall and gangly, wearing a baggy yellow suit with red puffballs trailing down his front. Spiky tufts of red hair poked out from the tops and the sides of his head, and in one oversized hand, the clown held a bouquet of balloons, all in a variety of different animal shapes. Everything about this situation put my teeth on edge, the mural most of all. "This is so fun, don't you think?" Croc said, tail waggling happily. "In what way does this constitute fun?" I asked, glancing down at the dog. "We're in school, Dan. Personally, I never got to go to school, but I always thought it would be so much fun. Reading books. Learning about all the interesting facets of the universe. Making the best of friends who will stay with you for the rest of your life. High school seems like it would be a magical place." The dog canted its head and looked at me. "Did you go to school, Dan?" "Of course I went to school. Go Blue Devils," I replied almost by reflex. "Never went to college or anything like that," I added after a second. "The Marine Corps was the closest thing I ever got to higher education, but most kids in America at least spend a good chunk of their formative years with their asses stuck behind desks, learning to recite a bunch of bullshit they'll never end up using. I can still tell you what the quadratic formula is, even though I've never once used it. Not since the day after I squeaked by with a C in algebra." "Wow, the quadratic formula," Croc marveled. "I don't know what that is, but it sounds very impressive. Did they have a lot of singing in your school, Dan? Because I feel like all the impromptu musical numbers would have been where I really excelled, if I'd gone to school instead of being born as a defective monster, destined to be alone forever." I frowned at the dog. "1. You're not defective. You might not be like the rest of the mimics, but that ain't a bad thing. We've already killed enough normal mimics to fill a dump truck, but you're still alive and kicking while they're dead and gone. If anything, you're the next step in mimic evolution. And 2, what in the hell are you talking about? Impromptu musical numbers? That isn't a thing. Anywhere. Not even in those fancy, private liberal schools." Croc let out a shocked gasp. "Surely you are not telling me that the award-winning documentary High School Harmonies was factually inaccurate?" I based a core chunk of my identity around the ideas espoused in that film. I snorted. Sorry, bud. But most of the things that you see on TV or read about in books rarely represent real life, even when it's supposed to. That goes double, maybe even triple, for anything you find in the back rooms. But if you want a tour of school life, I'm pretty sure the unspeakable horrors this floor has to offer are pretty close to the real thing. Come on. I fixed Howler's hold in my mind's eye and cast unerring arrow. Blue light shot down the left-hand corridor, blurring right past the open lockers and the horrifying clown mural, then took a hard right at the T-juncture before vanishing out of sight. Of course we had to walk by the clown mural. I'd been naive to ever assume otherwise. This is my surprised face, I muttered, eyeing the mural again. Clowns. I fucking hated clowns. We're going that way, I said to Croc, jabbing a finger toward the left-hand path since only I could see the etheric blue trail. But stay close and only walk where I walk. Lots of traps tucked away inside those open lockers. I will be like your shadow, the dog replied without an ounce of concern as I headed into the hallway proper. I moved slowly, glancing between the lockers and the shaggy linoleum tiles on the floor. Several individual tiles glowed with a subtle red aura, and I knew they were connected to whatever was hiding away in the lockers, working on the same metaphysical principle as the red twinning yarn we'd been using to direct potential customers back to the store. Curious, I crouched and tossed a loose screw onto one of the glowing tiles, just to see what would happen. The second the screw landed there was a click followed by a series of thwacks as a flurry of arrows exploded from one of the lockers. Except they weren't arrows at all, I realized after a second. They were oversized pencils, each as thick as my finger and as long as my forearm. As the explosion of pencils lanced the opposite wall, the innocent cherubic giggles I'd been hearing suddenly transformed into unholy wails and pained screams. The sound was so close and so loud I dropped my hammer in surprise and clapped my hands over my ears so the drums wouldn't rupture. The crude mural drawings were writhing in place, their painted arms waving and flapping as the pictures peeled themselves off the plaster. Dweller 0.738b, Funtime Doodle, Level 8. The imagination of a child is a pure and wondrous thing. So powerful, in fact, that it can imbue life and whimsy into even the simplest of creations. A favorite toy, say. Or a cherished childhood blanket, threadbare and stained. Or even a drawing. Unfortunately for you, the child who drew this particular mural isn't one of those fun, adorable, gifted kids that you read about in the Smil book mom groups. Little Timmy was one sick fuck. Broken home, addicts for parents, and with a penchant for playing surgeon with all the furry little friends in the backyard. So, instead of whimsy, these pictures are filled with little Timmy's murderous bloodlust and insatiable desire for world domination. Several of the stick-figure drawings had pencil arrows jutting out from their chests or faces, with a good chunk of their HP already gone. But there were a half-dozen of the doodles, all crawling off the walls and surging toward me like hungry zombies. Even worse, they weren't alone. Slowly emerging from the wall was the looming form of the yellow-suited clown, with his bright red pom-poms and his tufts of triangular spiked hair poking out like spearheads. Dweller 0.7813a, Harold the Funtime Imagination Friend, Level 13. If you thought the Funtime Doodles were bad, just wait until you meet little Timmy's imaginary friend, Harold the Terror Clown. Thanks to a total lack of parenting or the intervention of any responsible adult, Harold is the pure distillation of Timmy's murderous impulses. Harold is roid all wrapped up in a cheap silk suit of confusion, anger, and pain for a childhood which ended far too soon. It'd be tragic if this fucking horror wasn't going to juggle your organs like bowling pins. I waved away the description as the first doodle dropped its blocky shoulders and charged, its mouth contorting in a ravenous maw. I thrust my left hand forward, fingers splayed wide, and activated Slippery when wet, coating the patch of floor between us with a slick coat of sudsy water. The doodle's foot came down, and the creature promptly slipped, activating another one of the trap tiles glowing red in my vision. One of the lockers erupted with a colossal boom, and a spitball the size of a truck tire sideswiped the son of a bitch, plastering the doodle against the wall. The gooey wad of paper and saliva didn't do any damage, but the stick figure was stuck fast, its legs dangling uselessly above the floor. I unleashed Drano Bolt and activated Split Cast in the same instant. A pair of bright blue lances of power erupted from my palm, one splattering the creature against the wall with corrosive magic, another hitting one of the doodles in the chest with a sizzle. The dual spells triggered the Wild Surge ability baked into my stupid Versace bathrobe, instantly replenishing a huge chunk of mana and duplicating the originally split-cast Drano Bolt, free of charge. Both blasts landed again, instantly killing the doodle stuck to the wall, and dropping the other one down into the critical hit zone. I didn't have time to grab my fumbled hammer off the floor, so instead I pulled out my demolition screwdriver and slammed it straight into the doodle's stick figure throat. I was not at all ready for the spurt of black ink that erupted from the wound, and directly into my open mouth. It tasted like turpentine and made me gag. I yanked the screwdriver free, snagged my hammer from the floor, then swiped the back of my hand across my lips, wiping away the revolting smudge of ink and paint. God, this place was so gross. Each level was a brand new study in disgusting, and I was quickly becoming a doctoral candidate in absolute nastiness. Croc had swollen in size, rearing back on two legs as it swiped at one doodle with a clawed mitt as big as a grizzly's paw. The mimic's hulking torso had split open, revealing enormous, spiked jaws. A pair of tentacles extended from Croc's guts, holding another doodle aloft and crushing its frail form like a constricting anaconda. There were still two more doodles on the loose, not to mention Harold, though, curiously, the clown loitered in the back and didn't seem too keen to approach. But maybe that was because it didn't need to get its hands dirty? A small cloud of shiny, rubber animal balloons were floating toward me at a rate that was far too fast to be normal. Not that there was anything normal about this situation. I raised my hand and unleashed another Drano Bolt at an encroaching green balloon in the shape of a frog. The spell splashed off the shiny plastic, doing no damage and not even slowing the balloon down. Damn it. The balloons were inorganic material. Drano Bolt had the same core weakness as its first iteration, it only affected living matter. And naturally it was the only ranged spell at my disposal. But I was a Marine. Improvise, adapt, and overcome had been pounded into my head so often that it was now a part of my DNA. I pulled the tactical speed square from its holster, cut back my arm, and hurled that son of a bitch like a ninja star with all the strength a 10 and athleticism could muster. The speed square flipped gracefully, end over end, and hit the balloon frog with a pop. The balloon erupted in a wave of emerald power that obliterated the nearby doodle and swatted me through the air like the hand of an angry god. I flipped ass over tea kettle and landed in a heap, curls of smoke rising off me as my HP bar strobed an angry shade of red. "The balloons are bombs," I said, hoping Croc would be able to hear me. The words came out as an inarticulate croak, my throat raw and bloody. "Yeah," came a pained reply from beside me. "Sort of figured that out when it blew off my leg," Croc replied, still sounding remarkably chipper. The mimic was lying 6 feet away and had reverted back to its natural form, a blob of bright blue goop with too many arms to count, all covered with eyes and circular mouth orifices. A health bar hung above its head, and the mimic wasn't in much better shape than I was. There was still one doodle left, plus Harold and all of his fun balloons, which were drifting our way, carried by an unfelt breeze. With numb fingers I fished out the super slammer of shielding and plunked it down between me and Croc, whispering, "Let's pog," under my breath. The golden birdcage erupted in a dome of brilliant sparks, just in time to intercept the oncoming doodle and another of the balloon-borne IEDs. The last remaining doodle, a girl in a triangular black dress with yellow pigtails poking out of her round head, bounced ineffectually off the shield. A floating lion hit next, and I flinched as a wave of orange and red light bubbled out. The explosion swallowed the other balloons, which set off a daisy chain of rippling destruction. Boom. 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 The floors quaked and I was sure the roiling flames would sharp roil us alive. But the shield held without so much as a flicker, rebuffing the destruction as the timer spun down. The blast incinerated the last doodle and obliterated the lockers, setting off the remainder of the traps. I used the time to get to my feet, retrieve my hammer, and pull 2 deliciously refreshing Zimas from storage. I handed one to Croc, then chugged the other, tossing the bottle away into the rubbish decorating the rest of the floor. Croc had gained its feet as well and was back in the hulking form of a dog bear. We had about 50 seconds left to go on the shield, but I wasn't keen on wasting any more time. We still had to take out Harold the Terror Clown. Although the last round of explosions had detonated all of his explosives, the freak had more flaccid balloons hanging at his side and was already starting to inflate another. He was about 30 feet away, and we were never going to get a better chance to smoke him than now. "I need a boost, Croc," I yelled, a plan suddenly coming together in my head. "I'm gonna kick off your hands and you're gonna hurl me toward the clown. You got that? You want me to throw you, Dan?" the dog bear asked, sounding legitimately confused. "Yep," I said. "Just aim right for that asshole. On 3. 1. I reached down and picked the coin up. 2. I deactivated it with the arcane catchphrase of yesteryear. "That's so single quote 90s. 3. I roared as the golden barrier vanished with 32 seconds left on the countdown timer. At the same time, I leapt up and planted my foot in Croc's oversized paw, kicking off as I triggered moving walkway. Croc heaved, using the sheer weight of its body to hurl me through the air and directly at Harold. The clown had blown up another balloon, this one a deep purple, and was already furiously tying it into a new animal shape. But I was too fast. I was speed. Between Croc's throw, the force of my kick, and moving walkway, which increased the speed of my forward momentum by a factor of 3, I was a bona fide human cruise missile. I funneled mana into the hammer already in my hand, and it swelled in size and burned with a blue light that reminded me of a falling star. Harold's eyes went wide, and the stupid balloon animal was only halfway finished when I brought my hammer crashing into the side of his head, still in mid-flight. The fallout from the balloon explosions had already brought the clown into gavel of get-fucked range, and I triggered the attack without the smallest shred of mercy. This asshole had almost killed me and my dog, well, sort of dog, but for that I could forgive him. After all, this was a dog-eat-dog world, and it was kill or be killed. But he was also a clown, and that was simply inexcusable. Harold's head exploded as the hammer landed, but instead of spraying blood and gore, a colorful geyser of party confetti erupted outward along with a pair of notifications. Level up. X1 Research Achievement Unlocked. Human Cannonball. Gravity, physics, and sheer fucking audacity. These are the 3 forces that govern your trajectory as you hurtle through the air, headfirst like a suicidal moron. Most ranged warriors prefer to fire things like bullets, or rocks, or hives filled with angry bees, but not you. You are the projectile. Launched skyward, foes can only watch in horror and amazement as you descend like a lumpy, flesh-colored meteor, bathrobe flapping majestically in the wind. Reward, 1x Silver Acrobatics Loot Token. Title, Human Cannonball, decrease fall damage by 25% whenever you are bodily used as a projectile weapon. I didn't have time to read through the notice before I landed flat on my face, flipping and rolling several times before finally sliding to a stop on my back. The collision had knocked a fully 20% off my total health, putting me at just above the 50% mark, and I'd broken a rib in the process. That would heal quickly, but man did it hurt like a bitch in the interim. Worst of all, I was covered in colorful bits of confetti. Problem was, the flakes of confetti were heavy and wet and strangely gristly. Turned out clowns weren't made of confetti after all. Their meat was just rainbow-colored. Chapter 36 After looting the corpses and recovering my speed square, I planted my VIP doorway anchor and popped into the store to distribute my 5 new enhancement points and swap around some relics. The doodles dropped a variety of common and uncommon shards, but each one carried a common grade relic called Doodle Buddy, which served as a summoning spell that allowed the user to conjure a level 4 doodle. The minion would exist for 10 minutes, or until destroyed. The mana cost was pretty high, at 30 a pop, and it had an internal cooldown of 20 minutes, so it wasn't the kind of thing I could spam endlessly, but I felt like it had some decent potential. Since I only had 10 slots to play with, I reluctantly swapped it out for Bad Trip, though I deposited the uncommon mind-based relic into my own personal storage. The other 5 doodle buddies I added to the store's relic stock. Harold the Terror Clown had also dropped a pair of relics, one common grade, the other uncommon. Both were worthy considerations, at least initially. The first, appropriately titled Balloon Menagerie, conjured slow-moving balloon animal bombs, which would seek out targets then explode for extraordinarily high burst damage. On the surface it sounded great, but once I cracked the hood and peeked below, I saw there were a couple of significant catches. First, the cast time for creating new balloons was 10 seconds, which was absurdly long, and though you could hold up to 5 balloons at a time, they were extremely volatile. A fact I'd witnessed for myself, firsthand. Breathe on them wrong or look at them funny and they were just as likely to nuke you as your enemies. The other drawback, which was a deal-breaker for me, was that the relic resembled a red, rubber clown nose, and when you used it, a corresponding red clown nose appeared on your face. As far as I was concerned, that made it even worse than the Mask of the Faceless, which slowly stole away the user's face until they were a blind husk of a human being devoid of eyes or nose or mouth. In my estimation, it was better to have no eyes at all than to bear the indignity of looking in the mirror every day, only to see a clown staring back. Needless to say, I put the godforsaken relic up for sale and would pray for the poor soul desperate enough to use it. The other relic was a small item called Squirting Flower. It looked like a bright yellow sunflower with a small plastic tube running out the back, which was attached to a red hand pump. Like the cursed nose, this particular relic also summoned an accompanying physical manifestation, attaching a yellow sunflower to the user's lapel, which could unleash a quick, concentrated burst of water that dealt 5 points of slashing damage on contact. The mana cost was next to nothing, but it was still dog shit compared to everything else I had equipped. Thing was, it synergized with 2 other relics, Slippery When Wet and the Scalding Torrent I'd picked up from the steam gin on the 2nd floor. Best of all, the 3 items all buzzed like a hornet's nest when I brought them together, and when I ran the codex compatibility analysis, it came back with an 89% match for a badass little ability called Pressure Washer. Pressure Washer. Rare relic, level 1. Range, single target. Cost, 5 mana seconds. People underestimate the power of water, forgetting that, given enough time, water carved the Grand Canyon. You don't have millions of years to wait, though, so we cranked the power of water up to 90,000 psi and funneled it into a stream the size of your pinky finger. This shit can cut through steel and is hot enough to boil a live lobster. You're welcome. The target receives 1 stack of water erosion on contact, suffering 15 points of slashing damage, and receives an additional 5 points of scalding damage per second while directly in the water stream. For every 3 consecutive seconds spent in the water stream, an additional stack of water erosion is added, dealing 15 more points of slashing damage. When an enemy receives 5 stacks of water erosion, all damage dealt triples for each subsequent stack thereafter. I whistled through my teeth when I read the report in its entirety. Pressure Washer had a similar mechanic to the Flamethrower relic, but without any of the terrible, potentially explosive, side effects. The additional stacking damage could make it a powerhouse long-term. It did occupy the same ranged magical attack slot as Draino Bolt, which wasn't ideal, and it didn't have the stamina or mana drain effects, either. But it did have one benefit Draino Bolt was lacking. It would work on anything. Not just organic matter. My overall athleticism score was still weak sauce, and casting magic was my strong suit. Except, I didn't have many offensive spells, which had nearly killed me during the battle with Harold the Terror Clown. Pressure Washer would give me some versatile ranged options, and I could also probably use it to slice through chunks of the backrooms itself, if I needed to. I'd have to sacrifice Slippery When Wet, which sucked balls, since that was my only crowd control style spell, but it was worth the price of admission. I forged the shiny new relic, added it to my spatial core, then quickly used the monolith to drop 3 more points into resonance, and a point apiece into grit and athleticism. Then Croc and I were back at it, scouring the 7th floor for the elusive Howler's Hold. ****. Even with an unerring arrow to guide us, the process was as slow as old people shuffling through the food line at a country buffet. The arrow was awesome, a literal lifesaver that made navigating the floor possible, but it still had limitations. It ate mana like a hungry pit bull and only lasted for 30 seconds at a time, plus the backrooms were just fucking enormous. The arrow was great for finding a targeted location within a single quadrant or even finding an exit or stairwell to a specific floor, because there were lots of available options. But when the location you were looking for was several quadrants away, it was a slog, even with the perfect route laid out like a magical version of Google Maps. I felt like Frodo, trekking my ass across half of Middle-earth to return the One Ring. Croc and I spent the next 2 days tediously grinding through the school zone, avoiding countless school-themed traps and legions of doodles, clowns, and even worse horrors. There were packs of Hellraiser bondage nuns who weren't particularly strong, but wielded a powerful mental magic called repressed Catholic guilt, which could leave you weeping uncontrollably on the floor. We avoided Quadrant 17 like the plague, since apparently it was home to the Mother Superior of the Sisters of Silent Shadows, which added extra time onto the trek. The playgrounds, which were everywhere, were even worse. The equipment was all built from old sheet metal that was as hot as a stove burner and so rusty that even looking at them would give you tetanus. The dusty sandpits beneath the playgrounds held gargantuan worms, which had clearly been inspired by the Shai-Hulud of Dune. That or tremors. It was hard to say, though they were terrifying as hell either way. Croc and I had to American Ninja our way across the scalding playground equipment, swinging from monkey bars and scaling dubious rope bridges as though we were kids playing the floor is lava. Except if you stepped on the floor, a giant sandworm would eat your leg. The worst terror by far, however, was Gussie Gander. That sadistic, goose-bodied motherfucker. Every so often as we trudged through the winding halls of high school hell, I'd hear a faint snatch of that old nursery rhyme. A nursery rhyme which had both confused and frightened me as a kid. Gussie Gander, whither shall I wander? Upstairs and downstairs. And in my lady's chamber. There I met an old man, who wouldn't say his prayers, so I took him by his left leg, and threw him down the stairs. It was creepy and unnerving as shit. What even was a Gussie Gander? Why was it in some lady's chamber? And, most importantly, why the hell did this goose feel the need to commit elder abuse? All I had were questions, never any answers. The voice would only whisper a single line of the poem at a time, and sometimes the words were so faint that I almost thought it was a trick of my imagination. Until the last line bled from the air and a mutant tortoise, half man, half goose, easily 10 feet tall, and built like a brickshith house, materialized out of nowhere like an avenging angel of the Lord, fully prepared to smite the wicked. Before I could do a damned thing, the asshole gooseman summoned a set of concrete steps, picked me up by my ankle, and hurled me down the stairs with a flick of his wrist. I broke my collarbone and lost about 15% of my total HP, due to the fall. And then, just as quickly as he appeared, the horror goose vanished. Gone in the blink of an eye like a bad dream. Except then the rhyme would start all over again, the tension building and building with each passing line. Every hour or so, I'd hear another snatch of verse and I knew the goose was one step closer. And it wasn't like I could do anything to stop the monster. It was level 32, so even if I threw every spell I had in my arsenal, it wouldn't even make a dent in its health pool. The impending sense of dread and doom, coupled with the complete helplessness of the situation, was a form of intense psychological warfare. A form of intense psychological warfare that worked extremely well. Pretty soon I was jumping every time I saw a shadow flicker in the corner of my eye. The goose pitched me down the stairs 4 more times before I finally remembered the rules, so neatly scrawled on the chalkboard in the classroom. Rule number 3, good boys and girls always say their prayers, or they will be taken by the left leg and thrown down the stairs. The innocuous line had seemed dumb and random at the time, But I started muttering a short prayer whenever the rhyme started up again, and the goose finally let me be. The whole time, I left copious notes, warning other delvers about the multitude of dangers, as well as nailing more and more red twinning rings to the walls, which all led to a door that I'd planted not far from where Croc and I had first entered the floor. Say your prayer. Doesn't matter to who. Just say a prayer or that sadistic gussy gander chucklefuck will literally throw you down a set of stairs. This survival tip brought to you by Discount Dan's Backroom Bargains. Tobe continued.